You won't believe what this passenger said to the obese woman during the flight. His attitude left everyone stunned and caused outrage. The international airport was bustling with the typical Friday activity. Hurried passengers, some irritated by delays, others simply anxious to reach their destination. Among them was Marina, a 38-year-old woman weighing 313 pounds, nervously fidgeting with her boarding pass between her fingers. Her breathing was already accelerated, not just from the effort of carrying her carry-on luggage through the terminal's long corridors, but from the anxiety she felt each time she needed to travel by plane. Marina had saved for months to visit her sister in another state, who had just had her first child. The trip was too important to cancel, despite the dread she felt. She was well acquainted with the ritual of silent humiliation that began at check-in, continued through security, and culminated in the moment of sitting on the plane. That morning, Marina had arrived 3 hours before boarding, a strategy to ensure she would be one of the first to enter the aircraft. She politely requested a seatbelt extender at the airline's reception desk in a low voice to avoid curious glances from other passengers. The attendant, in turn, announced in a loud voice that she would provide the item, causing several eyes to turn toward Marina. The boarding process began, and Marina was one of the first to enter the plane. She settled into the window seat in row 23 and immediately lowered the armrest between the seats. She knew she occupied more space than usual, but had purchased only one ticket, as she always did. She hoped that, with luck, the seat next to her would remain empty, or that someone understanding would sit there. Passengers continued boarding and finding their seats. The plane was almost full when a man of approximately 50 years, wearing a well-tailored suit, stopped in the aisle next to row 23. He looked at his boarding pass, then at Marina, and his face contorted in an expression of displeasure. "Excuse me, but I think there's been a mistake. This can't be my seat," he said, gesturing for the flight attendant. Marina felt her face burn. She knew exactly what was coming. She had been through this before, but it never stopped hurting. The flight attendant approached with a professional smile. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Yes," the man replied without lowering his voice. "I paid for a whole seat, not half a seat. This fat lady is clearly occupying part of my space." Silence fell over the nearby passengers. Some pretended not to hear, absorbed in their phones or books. Others made no effort to hide their curiosity, observing the scene unfolding. Marina closed her eyes for a moment, wishing she could disappear. This trip, which had already started stressfully, now promised to be torture. "Sir, please, if you could come with me," said the flight attendant, trying to avoid a bigger scene. "We'll check if there's another seat available." The man cast a final look of contempt at Marina before following the flight attendant down the aisle. The flight attendant and the man in the suit returned after a few minutes. Marina kept her gaze fixed on the window, pretending to be absorbed in the view of the runway, although her reflection in the glass revealed her red face and teary eyes. She could feel the gazes of other passengers, some curious, others pitying, many judgmental. "Mr. Mendez, unfortunately, all other seats are occupied. This is the only one available," explained the flight attendant in a low voice, but not low enough to prevent Marina from hearing. "This is unacceptable," the man protested, raising his voice. "I paid for my entire seat. It's not fair that I have to travel uncomfortably for 3 hours because the airline doesn't require people like her to buy 2 seats." Marina felt each word like a stab. Her 313 pounds seemed to weigh even more at that moment. She had spent years facing similar comments, looks of contempt, and the constant feeling that her body was an inconvenience to others. But she never got used to it. "Sir, please lower your voice," the flight attendant asked, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. "We're trying to resolve the issue in the best way possible." "Issue? The issue is obvious," the man insisted, pointing at Marina without any discretion. "She's occupying 2 seats with a single ticket." A young woman seated in the row in front turned around and intervened. "Sir, please have some consideration. We all just want to reach our destination in peace." The man ignored the comment and continued his complaint, now addressing the chief flight attendant who had approached. "I demand a solution. I won't travel under these conditions." Marina finally gathered the courage to speak. With a trembling but determined voice, she addressed the flight attendant. "If necessary, I can get off the plane and wait for the next flight. I don't want to cause any trouble." Several people around reacted with expressions of surprise and sympathy. Marina, the victim of the situation, was offering to solve the problem created by another passenger. The chief flight attendant shook his head. That won't be necessary, ma'am. The flight is about to take off, and we can no longer make changes to the passenger list. At that moment, an elderly lady who was seated a few rows ahead stood up with difficulty. I'll switch places with you, sir, she offered, looking directly at the man in the suit. My seat is in row 12 by the window. I'm sure you'll be more comfortable there. The man hesitated, surprised by the offer. His eyes moved from the elderly woman to Marina, then to the flight attendant, as if weighing his options. Finally, with a sigh of irritation, he accepted the exchange. As the man walked away, the elderly lady approached Marina. May I sit next to you, dear? She asked with a gentle smile. Marina, still trying to control her tears, simply nodded, unable to express in words the gratitude she felt. The elderly lady settled into the seat next to Marina with a gentle smile. My name is Beatrice, but everyone calls me Miss Bea, she introduced herself, adjusting the crocheted purse in her lap. Don't worry about that man, dear. Some people are so busy judging others that they forget to look at their own imperfections. Marina discreetly wiped away a tear that insisted on running down her face. Thank you. I'm Marina, she replied, her voice still choked with emotion. You didn't have to do this. Oh, but I did, Miss Bea responded firmly. I'm 78 years old, and I've learned that kindness is the only luxury that truly matters in this life. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Marina held her breath, as she always did during takeoff. Her 313 pounds seemed to weigh even more under the extended safety belt. As the plane gained altitude, she couldn't stop thinking about how this public humiliation was just another chapter in a long history of embarrassments related to her weight. I'm going to visit my sister, Marina commented, trying to divert her thoughts from the recent shame. She just had a baby, my first nephew. How wonderful, exclaimed Miss Bea, her blue eyes shining with genuine interest. Boy or girl? A boy. His name is Miguel, Marina replied, feeling a bit calmer talking about her nephew. The conversation flowed naturally between the two women. Miss Bea told stories about her 5 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, showing photos on an old cell phone she barely knew how to operate. Marina, in turn, shared stories about her work as a freelance graphic designer, a path she had chosen partly to avoid the challenges of a corporate office environment. After the snack service, when the flight had stabilized, Marina gathered the courage to address the subject that still weighed on her mind. I've always avoided flying. Situations like this. I understand perfectly, Miss Bea interrupted, placing her wrinkled hand on Marina's. People can be cruel without even realizing how much their words hurt. Marina nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. I'm 38 years old and I've spent my entire life being judged for my body. I've tried every kind of diet, but after a while I simply gave up. I learned to live with my 313 pounds, but in moments like this, it feels like all my effort to accept myself goes down the drain. Miss Bea remained silent for a moment, her eyes revealing a deep understanding. You know, Marina, life is too short to spend it trying to please others. That man, with all his money and status, is probably more unhappy than you can imagine. Happy people don't feel the need to put others down. The plane encountered sudden turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to light up. Marina gripped the armrest, feeling the familiar tightness of anxiety in her chest. Don't worry, Miss Bea said calmly. I've been through so much turbulence in life that this doesn't even make me blink anymore. She smiled, and Marina couldn't help but smile back, despite her fear. As the flight continued, the conversation between the two women deepened. Marina discovered that Miss Bea had been a literature teacher for nearly 5 decades and carried with her a wisdom that only years and experience can provide. The elderly woman, in turn, admired Marina's resilience and her ability to move forward despite the difficulties. When the plane began its descent for landing, Marina and Miss Bea were chatting like old friends. The turbulence had passed, both in the air and in Marina's emotions. She had shared with the elderly woman her daily struggles, not just with the weight of her 313 pounds, but with the constant battle against depression and anxiety that had accompanied her for years. Did you know this is the first time in 5 years that I'm visiting my sister? Marina confessed, watching the clouds dissipate through the window. I always make up excuses. Too much work, lack of money, anything to avoid having to face an airplane. And yet here you are, Miss Bea replied with admiration. That's courage, my dear. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, and Marina breathed a sigh of relief. She had survived not only the flight, but also another situation of public humiliation. As they waited to disembark, Marina noticed that the man in the suit occasionally glanced in her direction, his face now a mask of studied indifference. "He seems to be avoiding looking at us," Marina commented quietly. "He's probably embarrassed," Miss Bia responded. "Or maybe he's reflected on his behavior. Either way, you shouldn't care." When they were finally able to leave their seats, Marina helped Miss Bia stand up and retrieved her small suitcase from the overhead compartment. As they walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, Marina could feel some curious glances, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't care as much about them. In the arrival area, the flight attendant who had witnessed the incident approached Marina. "Ma'am, on behalf of the airline, I would like to apologize for what happened," she said discreetly. "It wasn't your fault," Marina replied, surprised by her own composure. "But I appreciate your concern." As they walked toward the baggage claim area, Marina noticed that the man in the suit was standing near the exit, speaking on the phone with irritation. As she passed him, Marina felt a twinge of apprehension, fearing another confrontation. To her surprise, the man interrupted his call and turned to her. "Ma'am," he called, his voice notably less arrogant. "I would like well, to apologize for my behavior on the plane. It was inappropriate." Marina froze, unable to respond. Miss Bia, at her side, gave her a gentle nudge of encouragement. "Thank you for acknowledging that," Marina finally replied, her voice firmer than she expected. The man nodded briefly and returned to his phone call. Marina and Miss Bia continued on their way in silence, both processing what had just happened. "See?" Miss Bia said at last. "Sometimes people can surprise us." In the baggage area, after retrieving their luggage, the moment of farewell arrived. Marina felt strangely reluctant to part with the lady who had transformed a humiliating experience into something bearable. "Miss Bia, I will never forget what you did for me today," Marina said, holding the elderly woman's hands in hers. "I didn't do anything special, dear," Miss Bia replied with a smile. "I just offered a bit of humanity in a world that sometimes seems to forget about it." The two exchanged phone numbers, promising to keep in touch. As she walked away toward the arrival area where her sister was waiting, Marina felt a weight being lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't the weight of her 313 pounds, but the much heavier burden of shame and fear that she had carried for so long. How often do we judge or are judged by our appearance? This story reminds us that behind every body, there's a person with dreams, fears, and stories to tell. True beauty isn't found in physical form, but in the capacity to show compassion when it would be easier to look away. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more content that makes us reflect on our attitudes and on the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Share it also with those who need to hear this message. Together, we can build a world where everyone feels welcome, regardless of their physical appearance.